Yes, Nia agreed, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope. And this time, we'll make them together. 1 year later, the autumn leaves danced around Gran's old house, now transformed but still holding its warm heart. The sign out front read simply, Hope's Kitchen, a place to heal. The morning sun streamed through freshly cleaned windows, catching the steam rising from cups of coffee and tea. Inside, Ray watched from the doorway as Nia taught a small group of people how to make Gran's chocolate chip cookies. The kitchen had been carefully renovated, new counters, better lighting, space for more people, but they'd kept the old stove where Gran had baked for decades. The secret, Nia was saying, is taking your time. No rushing, no shortcuts. Her audience nodded, writing notes in small notebooks. They were all healing from something, lost loved ones, broken trust, shattered dreams. Some were victims of scams similar to Peter's, others just needed a place to feel whole again. The court case had ended 3 months ago. Peter, whose real name turned out to be Arthur Green, had been sentenced to 15 years. The money was mostly gone, scattered through a maze of international accounts. But somehow that didn't seem to matter as much anymore. Remember to let the butter soften naturally, Nia continued, her voice steady and warm. Gran always said patience makes things sweeter. She caught Ray's eye and smiled, a real smile, not the brittle one she'd worn during those dark days with Peter. The doorbell chimed, and Ray went to answer it. A young woman stood there, clutching a newspaper clipping. Her eyes were red from crying. I read about this place, she stammered. About what happened to your wife and how she rebuilt. Come in, Ray said gently. The cookies are almost ready. The woman, Beth, followed him to the kitchen, where the smell of vanilla and melting chocolate filled the air. Nia looked up from her baking demonstration, immediately recognizing the lost look in Beth's eyes. Would you like to join us? Nia asked, pulling out a spare apron. We're just learning about doing things the slow way. As Beth integrated into the group, Ray slipped into Gran's old study, now converted into a small office. The walls were lined with resources, books about financial literacy, pamphlets about avoiding scams, contact information for legitimate counselors and support groups. On the desk sat a framed photo of Gran, her kind eyes watching over everything. The sound of laughter drifted in from the kitchen, real laughter, not the forced kind that had haunted their house during Peter's manipulation. Ray remembered how hollow their home had felt after everything fell apart, how he and Nia had struggled to find their way back to each other. They'd decided not to divorce, but it hadn't been easy. There were nights of painful conversations, days of rebuilding trust piece by piece. Like Gran's recipe, healing couldn't be rushed. They'd learned to be patient with each other, to recognize that recovery wasn't a straight line. The community center had started small, just weekend support groups and cookie baking lessons. But word spread, and soon they were offering financial literacy workshops, grief counseling, and a safe space for people to share their stories. They'd used what little they could recover from Peter's accounts, plus some careful budgeting and community donations, to make it work. Ray? Nia's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, flower on her cheek and peace in her eyes. The first batch is ready. Would you like to try one? He followed her back to the kitchen, where the group was gathering around the cooling rack. Beth was crying again, but these were different tears. They taste just like my mum's, she whispered, holding a warm cookie. I haven't baked since she passed. I thought it would hurt too much. Nia put an arm around her shoulders. Sometimes remembering the sweet things helped heal the bitter ones. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Ray and Nia sat on the porch swing that Gran had loved so much. The cookie jar between them was nearly empty, a good sign they'd learned of a healing day. I found something in the attic, Nia said quietly, pulling out an old envelope. Inside was a single cookie recipe card, yellowed with age. On the back, in Gran's handwriting, was a note they hadn't seen before. Sometimes life burns the edges of our dreams, but like a slightly overdone cookie, that doesn't make them worthless. It just means we learn to appreciate the sweet center even more. Nia leaned her head on Ray's shoulder, their hands finding each other naturally. The wedding ring was back on her finger, not the original one, but a simple band they'd chosen together when they decided to renew their vows. A fresh start, but with the wisdom of the past baked in. We're going to need to make more cookies tomorrow, Ray said, peeking into the nearly empty jar. The therapy office was painted a soft blue, with comfortable chairs and potted plants in every corner. Nia sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking smaller than Ray remembered. 3 months had passed since Peter's arrest, and this was their first counseling session together. Start wherever you feel comfortable, Dr. Chen said, her voice gentle but professional. She'd been recommended by one of the other victims, someone who understood the unique pain of betrayal mixed with grief. I keep having the same dream, Nia began slowly. I'm in Gran's kitchen. She's making her famous chocolate chip cookies, and I'm telling her about the wellness center. In the dream, she just listens, stirring the cookie dough. But when she turns around, all the chocolate chips have turned to pebbles, and she's crying. Ray watched a tear roll down his wife's cheek. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but the distance between their chairs felt like miles. The worst part isn't even losing the money, Nia continued. It's knowing how easily I threw away everything real for something fake. My marriage, my grandmother's trust, my self-respect. She wiped her eyes with the tissue Dr. Chen offered. I've been trying to understand why I fell for it, why I wanted so badly to believe him. Grief makes us vulnerable, Dr. Chen said softly. And skilled manipulators know exactly how to use that vulnerability. But I was so cruel, Nia's voice cracked. The things I said to Ray, the way I dismissed his concerns, I became someone I didn't even recognize. Ray shifted in his chair. I keep wondering if I could have done something differently. If I had approached you differently, or found the evidence sooner. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. It's natural to look back and see all the what-ifs, but blame doesn't heal anything. What matters now is understanding and growth. Later that evening, they stood in Gran's old kitchen. The house had been sitting empty since her passing, preserved like a museum of memories. Nia ran her hand along the counter where she used to watch her grandmother bake. I found something, she said quietly, pulling an envelope from her purse. When I was cleaning out Gran's desk yesterday, it was marked for future dreams. Inside was a letter, written in Gran's neat handwriting. Ray watched as Nia read it aloud, her voice trembling. My dearest girl, money is just paper until you give it meaning. I've watched you grow into someone who sees the good in everyone, who wants to help and heal. It's one of your most beautiful qualities, but sometimes the brightest lights attract the darkest moths. Don't let my savings become just numbers in an account. Use it to build something real, something you can touch, see, and share. But take your time. Real dreams don't demand urgency. They grow slowly, like the roses in my garden. Most importantly, remember that true wealth isn't in bank accounts. It's in the people who stand by you, who tell you hard truths because they love you, who help you up when you fall. All my love, Gran. Nia's hands shook as she folded the letter. She knew. Somehow, she knew I might be tempted by big promises. She looked around the kitchen, at the cookie jar still sitting on the counter, the old recipe box full of handwritten cards. I want to do something with this house. What do you mean? Ray asked. Not a wellness center, Nia said quickly, managing a small smile. But maybe a real community center, something small at first. A place where people who are grieving can actually heal, not be preyed upon. Where they can learn about financial literacy and avoiding scams. She paused. We could start with just this kitchen. Gran always said a cup of tea and a cookie could heal most hurts. Ray looked at his wife, really looked at her. The fake enthusiasm she'd shown with Peter was gone, replaced by something quieter but more genuine. Her eyes were clear now, focused on something real. The renovation would take time, he said carefully. We'd need proper permits, inspections. I know, Nia nodded. No shortcuts this time. No magical solutions. She pulled out her grandmother's recipe box. We start small. Maybe just weekend support groups at first. I could bake Gran's cookies. You never learned how to make them, Ray reminded her gently. Then that's where we start, Nia said, opening the box, with something real. Something I can learn properly, one step at a time. She looked up at Ray. Will you help me? Ray was quiet for a long moment, looking at the woman he'd married, not the stranger she'd briefly become, but the person now emerging from that dark chrysalis, humbled but somehow stronger. One batch at a time, he said finally, reaching for Gran's old apron hanging by the stove. And this time, we do it together. Ray watched them walk together toward the small cafe across the street, two strangers united by the same pain, the same betrayal. In the gathering darkness, their shared griefs seemed to make them glow like distant stars, small lights in the vast darkness of loss and regret. The police station smelled of coffee and printer paper. Ray sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, watching through a window as Detective Lynn questioned Nia in another room. His wife looked small under the fluorescent lights, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of untouched coffee. "Mr. Wilson." A young officer approached with a thick folder. "We found these in the suspect's hotel room." He spread out dozens of photos on the table, all women, all with the same lost look in their eyes. Some were taken at grief support groups, others at coffee shops. Each photo had notes written on the back, inheritance amounts, property values, weaknesses to exploit. He studied them, the officer explained quietly. Learned their routines, their vulnerabilities. Your wife wasn't his first target, and she wouldn't have been his last. Ray picked up one photo. A woman sat on a park bench, crying. The note read, "Husband died, cancer. Insurance payout expected. Approach after funeral." His stomach turned. Detective Lynn emerged from the interview room, her face professionally neutral. "Your wife's given us everything she knows about his operation. The bank accounts, the fake documents, the whole script he used." She paused, checking her notes. He had it down to a science. First the grief counseling, then the spiritual guidance, then the big vision that would honor their loved ones' memories. "How much can you recover?" Ray asked, already knowing the answer from the detective's expression. "The money's gone through dozens of offshore accounts," she said gently. "We've frozen what we can, but most of it," she spread her hands helplessly. "He's been doing this for years. Different names, different cities, but always the same pattern." A commotion at the front desk drew their attention. A woman in her 60s burst in, clutching a newspaper. "I saw his picture in the morning news," she said breathlessly to the desk sergeant. "He called himself Robert when he took my money, said he was building a children's hospital." Throughout the day, more victims arrived. Some had lost everything to the same wellness center scheme, others to different dreams, eco-friendly housing developments, alternative medicine clinics, spiritual retreat centers. Each story was different, but the pain in their voices was the same. Ray watched as Nia listened to their stories, her face growing paler with each new revelation. When a young widow described how Robert had convinced her to sell her house for his fake cancer research facility, Nia ran to the bathroom and threw up. Later that evening, Ray found her sitting on a bench outside the police station, staring at nothing. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, but Nia didn't seem to notice its beauty. "I keep thinking about Gran," she whispered as Ray sat down beside her. "How hard she worked for that money. All those double shifts at the hospital, all those years of saving." Her voice broke. "She trusted me to do something good with it." "You wanted to help people," Ray said quietly. He took advantage of that. Nia pulled her grandmother's cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "I was so stupid. All those red flags, the way he rushed everything, how he always had excuses for why we couldn't see the real paperwork, why we had to act immediately." Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. "I wanted so badly to believe I was special, that I was part of something meaningful." A police car pulled up, and two officers led Peter, or whatever his real name was, toward the station doors. His designer suit was wrinkled now, his perfect hair disheveled. He caught sight of Nia and had the audacity to wink. Ray felt Nia stiffen beside him. But instead of crumbling, she stood up, her spine straightening. "I want to testify," she said to Detective Lynn, who had joined them outside. "I want to help make sure he never does this to anyone else." The detective nodded. "We'll need to go through everything again. All the conversations, all the meetings, every detail you can remember. It won't be easy." "None of this is easy," Nia said, watching as Peter disappeared into the station. "But Gran always said the right thing and the easy thing are rarely the same." As they walked to their car, Ray noticed Nia had taken off her wedding ring again. But this time, instead of leaving it behind, she handed it to him. "I don't deserve to wear this right now," she said softly. "I have to earn back everything." In the parking lot, they'd passed the young widow from earlier. She was crying in her car, illuminated by the setting sun. Nia paused, then walked over and gently tapped on the window. The two women looked at each other for a long moment before Nia spoke. "Would you like to get some coffee?" she asked. I think maybe we could both use someone who understands." Peter's face changed then, the mask dropping away completely. "You ungrateful little—" He took a step toward Nia, but Ray was already between them. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed through the windows. The sound of police sirens filled the air. Peter's eyes darted to the door, but Mrs. Chen was standing there now, holding her phone up, clearly recording everything. "I called them 10 minutes ago," she said calmly. "Right when I saw you sneaking around the back of the house." As the police officers walked in, Peter's perfect posture crumbled. For the first time, Ray saw him for what he really was, not a visionary or a spiritual leader, just a small, desperate man who preyed on people's grief and dreams. Nia watched in silence as the police led Peter away. Her grandmother's cardigan hung loose around her shoulders, and in the harsh light of the police cars, she looked very young and very tired. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not looking at Ray. "I'm so sorry." Ray didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. Instead, he just stood there, watching their neighbor comfort his wife, while evidence bags filled with dreams and lies were carried out into the night. The following week felt like walking through a fog. Ray found himself sitting in their living room late at night, surrounded by photo albums and paperwork. The private investigators' reports kept arriving, each one worse than the last. The man calling himself Peter had used 5 different names in 3 years. The wellness center blueprints were copied from a real facility in Arizona. The business licenses were forged. The sound of a car door slamming made Ray look up. Through the window, he watched Nia hurry up their front walk, looking over her shoulder as if afraid someone might see her. She'd been staying at her friend's house, only coming home when she thought he'd be at work. "You're here," she said, startled to find him in the living room. Her eyes fell on the scattered papers. "Still trying to prove he's a bad person." "Look at these," Ray said quietly, holding out a stack of documents. "These are statements from the other women. Lisa from Oregon lost her late husband's life insurance money. Annie from Colorado lost her retirement savings. Diane from Texas lost her—" "Stop it." Nia's voice cracked. "They're lying." Peter explained everything. Those women misunderstood the investment timeline. The wellness center just takes time to— "There is no wellness center," Ray interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "The land he showed you, it's not even for sale. I called the owner yesterday." Nia sank into their old armchair, the one her grandmother used to sit in during visits. "You don't understand. He's different with me. We have a connection. He says I'm special, that I understand his vision in a way no one else has." That's exactly what he told Lisa, Annie, and Diane. Ray spread out 3 nearly identical text messages on the coffee table. Same words, different names, different dates. The color drained from Nia's face as she read them. Her hands started shaking. These could be fake. You could have made these up." "Your friend Kate called me today," Ray said softly. "She's worried about you. Says you've been asking to borrow money. Says Peter keeps finding urgent reasons why the wellness center needs more funds." Tears started rolling down Nia's cheeks, but she wiped them away angrily. "He's just being thorough. Good things take time and money. Gran always said." Gran would be heartbroken, Ray cut in, immediately regretting his words as Nia flinched. "I'm sorry. That wasn't fair. But Nia, please, just talk to the police. Look at the evidence." "Evidence of what?" A new voice made them both jump. Peter stood in their doorway, his expensive suit somehow looking shinier than usual. "Evidence that we're creating something revolutionary?" Ray stood up slowly. "How did you get in here?" Peter held up a key. "Nia gave it to me. In case of emergencies." His smile was practiced, perfect. "And I'd said attempting to sabotage our project qualifies as an emergency." "Get out of my house." Ray's voice was low, dangerous. "Your house?" Peter laughed. "The house you can barely afford on your salary?" "Nia told me all about your financial struggles, how you've been holding her back. Now, Nia, sweetie, we need to go. The contractors are waiting to start breaking ground." "At 9 o'clock at night?" Ray asked. "Show her the permits, Peter. Show her the real estate deeds. Show her anything real. For just a moment, Peter's polished facade cracked. A flash of something cold and calculating crossed his face before the smooth smile returned. We don't have to prove anything to him, Nia. Remember what we talked about? About toxic people holding you back from your destiny. Nia stood up, swaying slightly. I need to see the papers. What? Peter's smile faltered. The permits. The deeds. Everything. Her voice grew stronger. If we're breaking ground tonight, you must have them with you. Of course they're in my car, Peter said smoothly. Let's go get them right now. No. Nia's voice was barely a whisper. Show me here. Now. The room grew very quiet. Even the usual creaks and groans of their old house seemed to hold their breath. Through the window, Ray could see their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, peeking out her curtains, phone in hand. He'd asked her to keep an eye out tonight. You're letting him poison your mind, Peter said, his voice taking on an edge. After everything I've done for you, the vision I shared with you, the vision you shared with Lisa. Nia's voice trembled as she picked up one of the papers. And Annie? And Diane? The argument started over dishes, something so small, so ordinary. Ray was loading the dishwasher when he found the receipt from Sterling Cafe tucked under a plate. 2 lunch specials, 2 glasses of champagne, a celebration of some kind. I thought we agreed to be careful with spending until we figured out what to do with the inheritance, he said quietly, holding up the wrinkled paper as Nia walked into the kitchen. She froze for a moment, then lifted her chin. I had a business lunch. At our restaurant? Ray's voice cracked slightly. With champagne? The silence stretched between them like a rubber band about to snap. Through their open window, they could hear children playing in the street, their laughter a stark contrast to the tension in the room. I need to tell you something, Nia said finally, sitting down at their kitchen table. The evening sun caught her face, highlighting the shadows under her eyes. She hadn't been sleeping well either. I've made a decision about the inheritance. Ray's hands stilled on the dishwasher door. We were supposed to make that decision together. It's my grandmother's money, Nia said, her voice taking on an edge he'd never heard before. And I found a way to honor her memory, to do something meaningful with it. The rubber band snapped. By giving it to that man from your support group, Ray watched her face pale. Yes, I know about him. The life coach with the fancy car and the temporary plates. His name is Peter, Nia shot back, standing up. And he's not just a life coach. He's a visionary. He's planning to build a wellness center that will help thousands of people. Gran always said money should be used to make a difference in the world. And you believe him. Ray's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. Have you even checked his credentials, his background? He understands me, Nia said, pacing now. He knows what it's like to lose someone, to want their memory to mean something. You just want to invest the money in boring stocks and mutual funds. Ray felt the world tilt sideways. How much have you given him? Nia stopped pacing. All of it. The words fell like stones in still water. Ray gripped the counter to steady himself. All 2.5 million? He needs it more than you, Nia said, but her voice wavered slightly. The wellness center will have healing gardens, meditation spaces, counseling rooms. It's what Gran would have wanted. Your grandmother would have wanted you to throw away her life savings on a stranger's promises. Ray's voice was barely a whisper now. Nia, this isn't like you. Can't you see what's happening? What's happening is that I'm finally doing something important with my life. She grabbed her phone from the counter. Look at the plans he's drawn up. Look at the vision. Ray stared at the sleek digital renderings on her screen, beautiful buildings surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. Too perfect, like something from a stock photo website. Have you seen any actual paperwork? He asked. Building permits, land deeds, business registrations. Peter handles all of that, Nia said, but uncertainty flickered across her face. He has connections. He knows people. Like he knew the other women? The words slipped out before Ray could stop them. Nia's head snapped up. What other women? Ray pulled out his own phone, opening the email he'd received that morning from the private investigator. 3 other women in the past 2 years, all recently bereaved, all with substantial inheritances, all convinced to invest in different versions of the same dream. He paused, watching the color drain from her face, and all the money gone without a trace. You had me investigated. Nia's voice shook with fury. How dare you? How dare I? Ray's voice finally broke. You gave away our future without even talking to me. 8 years of marriage, and you didn't even think I deserved a conversation. It's not your money. Nia shouted, but tears were forming in her eyes. No, it's not, Ray agreed softly. But I thought I was your partner. I thought we made big decisions together. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, the new one they'd bought last year, planning for a future that now seemed to be evaporating like morning dew. On the wall, Gran's old clock ticked steadily, marking each moment of their unraveling marriage. Nia's phone buzzed. Peter's name flashed on the screen. She stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at Ray, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and fear. I have to go, she whispered. He's waiting for me. We're finalizing the plans tonight. As she turned to leave, Ray noticed she'd left her wedding ring on the counter again. This time, he didn't pick it up. 3 weeks had passed since that morning in the kitchen, and Ray found himself sitting in his car outside the community center, his hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The grief support group sign hung crookedly in the window, its letters faded from sun exposure. He'd followed Nia here, something he never thought he'd do in their marriage, but her behavior had become impossible to ignore. It started with small things. Her phone would quickly flip face down whenever he entered the room. She'd changed her password, angling the screen away when typing it in. Their evening talks had dwindled to brief exchanges about groceries and bills. But it was the laughter that bothered him most, those quiet chuckles coming from their spare room late at night when she thought he was asleep. Just give me some time, she'd say whenever he tried to discuss the inheritance. I'm processing Gran's death in my own way. But Ray knew there was more to it. The Nia he knew would have spent hours planning with him, dreaming about their future together. This Nia felt like a stranger. Through the community center's large windows, Ray could see people gathering in a circle of chairs. Nia sat near the edge, her copper-colored cardigan, Gran's last Christmas gift to her, standing out among the crowd. But it was the man sitting next to her that caught Ray's attention. Tall, well-dressed, probably in his 40s, he leaned too close when Nia spoke, his hand occasionally brushing her arm. Ray's phone buzzed. A text from their neighbor Mrs. Chen. Saw Nia at Sterling Cafe yesterday. Thought you should know she wasn't alone. His stomach churned. Sterling Cafe was their special place where he proposed, where they celebrated anniversaries. Nia had claimed she was working late that day. The support group session ended, but Nia didn't leave. Through the window, Ray watched as others filtered out while she stayed behind, deep in conversation with the well-dressed man. They were looking at something on his tablet, his perfectly manicured finger pointing at the screen while Nia nodded enthusiastically. Ray's phone buzzed again. This time it was a bank notification, one he'd set up after noticing strange patterns in their joint account. His heart stopped as he read the message. Transfer completed. $100,000. Inside the community center, Nia was laughing at something the man had said, her hand resting on his forearm. The sight of her wedding ring glinting under the fluorescent lights, the same ring he'd found on the counter 3 weeks ago, made Ray feel sick. She put it back on after that morning, but somehow it looked different now, like a prop in a play. He pulled out his laptop, opening the browser history he'd recovered from their home computer. The searches told their own story: life coaching certification costs, wellness center startup expenses, spiritual healing investment opportunities. Each entry felt like another crack in the foundation of their marriage. A sleek black car pulled up to the community center. The well-dressed man opened the door for Nia, his hand lingering on her back as she got in. Ray watched them drive away, heading in the opposite direction of their home. He noticed the car's license plate was temporary, brand new, just like the designer watch the man had been wearing. Back home, Ray sat in their dim kitchen, surrounded by memories. There was the coffee maker they'd bought together at that little shop in Portland, the refrigerator magnets from their vacations, the silly Kiss the Cook apron Nia had given him last Christmas. Now each item felt like a question mark. He opened his laptop again, starting a new search: how to track large financial transfers. As he typed, a forgotten conversation floated back to him. Gran's voice, wise and gentle: money doesn't just test the poor dear. Sometimes it tests the wealthy even more. The house creaked and settled around him as evening turned to night. Naya still hadn't come home. On the kitchen counter, her favorite mug sat unwashed from morning, a faint lipstick mark on its rim. Next to it lay an unfamiliar business card that must have fallen from her purse. Transform your life today. Executive life coach and spiritual advisor. Ray picked up the card, turning it over in his hands. The paper was expensive, the design sleek, but something about it felt off, like everything else in his life lately. He pulled out his phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing the number of a private investigator a colleague had recommended. As it rang, he glanced at their wedding photo hanging on the wall, wondering when exactly their happy ending had started to unravel. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting long shadows across the granite countertop where Ray sat with his untouched coffee growing cold. His wife Naya stood by the sink, her back turned to him as she stared out the window at their small garden. The silence between them felt heavy, unusual for a couple who usually couldn't stop chatting over their morning routine. $2.5 million, Ray repeated softly, the number feeling strange on his tongue. He watched Naya's shoulders tense at his words. Her grandmother Rose had passed away 3 weeks ago, and the reading of the will had just concluded yesterday afternoon. The inheritance amount had shocked everyone, especially since Rhodes had lived so modestly in her small suburban home. "I still can't believe it," Naya whispered, finally turning around. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched her phone tightly in her hand. Gran never mentioned anything about having this kind of money. All those years she kept refusing our offers to help with her bills. Ray nodded, remembering how Rose would wave away their concerns with a gentle smile, insisting she had everything she needed. They'd been worried about her living alone on what they thought was just her pension. Now, the truth of her secret savings painted those memories in a different light. "She was always so careful with money," Nia continued, her voice catching. "Remember how she used to clip coupons from the Sunday paper? We'd sit at her kitchen table for hours, sorting them by expiration date." A small smile crossed her face at the memory, but it quickly faded. Ray stood up and walked to the calendar hanging on their fridge. Their life plans were marked in different colored inks: the house repairs they'd been postponing, the vacation they'd been saving for, the baby room they hoped to furnish someday. Dreams that had seemed distant just yesterday now felt surprisingly within reach. "Maybe we could finally fix that leaky roof," he suggested gently, trying to lift the heavy mood. "Your gran always said it made her nervous when she visited during rainstorms." But Nia wasn't looking at the calendar. Her attention had returned to her phone, her thumb scrolling quickly through something Ray couldn't see. There was a distance in her eyes that made him uneasy, something he'd never seen before in their 8 years of marriage. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, still not meeting his gaze, "about what Gran always used to say about money being a tool for change." She trailed off, biting her lip. Ray waited for her to continue, but she just kept scrolling through her phone. The morning silence stretched between them again, broken only by the gentle hum of their refrigerator and the distant sound of their neighbor's wind chimes. "I've been attending these support meetings," Naya finally said, her voice taking on an odd tone. "For grief, you know. There's someone there who has these amazing ideas about helping people, about making a real difference in the world." Something in her voice made Ray's coffee cup pause halfway to his lips. He studied his wife's face carefully, noting how she seemed to be choosing her words with unusual precision. "What kind of ideas?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral despite the sudden knot forming in his stomach. "I'm not ready to talk about it yet," Naya replied quickly, too quickly. She pushed away from the counter, grabbing her car keys. "I need to go to the store. We need milk." Ray watched her hurry out, knowing full well there was a full gallon in the fridge. As the front door clicked shut, he sat back down at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched coffee mug. The morning sun had shifted, and now it caught the diamond in her wedding ring, left forgotten on the counter next to the sink. In 8 years, she had never taken it off. Something was changing, shifting like the shadows across their kitchen floor. Ray couldn't name it yet, but he felt it in his bones. This inheritance was going to test their marriage in ways he never could have imagined. He picked up her ring, the metal still warm from her finger, and closed his fist around it, wondering what storms were gathering on their horizon.